Good morning, everybody. I, for one, am dying to know who's going to get the couch, because it's not me. So Brad introduced a bit of our work, and I just will give you a very quick backdrop. But it's based, this beef case study that we have been doing, and I'm going to get into it in a second, is based on a question, and that is, how is it that the beef sector can work or work better together to position itself for future success? And that question is based on some previous work that we undertook. We're based on a premise, which is strategic change and competitive success requires a broad, integrated approach. It's about how the beef food system can work or work better, which really does pick up on what Terry was saying just a moment ago. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So over the course of late 2011, we did some extensive work into the beef sector. We interviewed about 80 people across the sector. We had a number of one-on-one consultations, presentations to boards of directors, associations, many institutions over the course of the winter of 2012. We presented in front of the Beef Value Chain Roundtable a few times. I'm sure we'll be back. And we had an individual workshop with a variety of players. So we really did reach out and wanted to find out what was on the minds of those in the sector. What was the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats that they saw. Now, our work is not yet published. We hope to come out with that in the next several weeks or so, hopefully earlier. But I'm going to try to just to extrapolate or extract from that work some highlights. And then I'm going to get into some interesting vignettes that I hope may underscore some principles of change that is at the core of our work. So the first thing I'm going to do is just share with you what was a prevailing series or prevailing views within the sector. And this is something that seemed to permeate no matter who we spoke to, with some exceptions, but generally across the sector. And that was, there seems to be a need, this deep-seated need for a strategy. In fact, there's no sense of shared long-term strategy within the beef sector. The second thing was this notion of alignment. There seems to be a need, a yearning for having alignment because there's a sense there's not a great deal of collaboration or there's minimal connection to a common set of objectives. And the third is that there seems to be a lot of voices in the sector, but no player or players seem to be moving that sector toward greater collaboration. So what can be done about all this? So we're going to rely on a few vignettes to sort of bring out some principles and ideas from a variety of players to sort of get the notion of what's driving people strategically. And what I want to emphasize is our work is not about just pointing out what the problems are, but trying to identify what might be solutions or solution pathways. And so these vignettes, or what we would call just perhaps models, really hope to get at some key principles. And really what you'll see in them, some work well and some don't work so well. What you see is that how supply chains are collaborating. You'll see how they're using performance benchmarks and metrics and targets to galvanize action across a diverse set of players. You'll see how the supply chains are managing their natural resource base to some degree and are trying to satisfy the consumer's needs and wants and anticipating what those societal expectations are. Familiar themes from what you just heard. You'll also see from these vignettes how some of the players are working with a broad variety of so-called non-food stakeholders, NGOs, researchers, people in the health field and others. And you think of all those attributes, and this is sort of what forms the basis for us of what the food system is all about. It's no more about managing issues on behalf of a segment, a producer, a processor. It really requires this broad and integrated approach. So I'm going to turn to the first, and this has to do with blade farming in the United Kingdom. And what's interesting about blade is it's one of UK's largest beef operations. It created a model that essentially focuses on quality. It grew out of the need to address a variety of problems, particularly around producer profitability and high feed prices in 2000. They essentially operate a franchise model. But Blade acts as the champion. And what it did is it galvanized the producers, the players, to deliver value in an integrated fashion. In nearly every aspect of this chain, they manage the quality, they have information systems, and they ensure that the product gets to their customers, McDonald's and Tesco, one of the largest retailers in the UK. And from conception to processing, all these decisions are made with quality in mind, continuous improvement, minimizing waste, and so forth. So what's been the outcome of this experience with Blade in this particular scenario? Well, they've been able to reduce cost of production. They've been able to get producers better prices. They're focusing on feed conversion rates. Blade provides producers with various services from veterinary to production planning. And they assess performance at every stage or step along the way so that every player knows essentially how they're measuring up, and there's a series of rewards and penalties based on that assessment. Essentially, what they've done is they've ensured quality of the cattle or the beef that's being produced, and it's essentially pre-sold to their retail customers, all in the name to ensure customer satisfaction. And let me turn to another example. This is the state of South Australia. This one perhaps didn't work so well. What was the problem there? Well, familiar: producer profitability, high feed costs. They were also challenged with a very uncoordinated or fragmented supply chain, many stakeholders. They couldn't seem to get that coordination. So finally, this beef industry board, a state-run organization, pulled folks together. They set up a strategy, or a team, to develop a strategy. The objective was to create an opportunity to grow the beef sector in that state in Australia, develop a strategy based on improving carcass value, information sharing across the supply chain, and so forth. Very familiar. So how did it succeed? Well, in 2005, it set itself up for a 10-year plan called the Beef Industry Strategy. But what happened, as far as we were able to tell, is it really fell short on execution. Too many objectives, alignment was challenging. Many of the producers were more focused on accessing diminishing amount of government funds than wanting to collaborate. There was a sense of lack of industry ownership on strategy. Accountability was hindered by the inevitable jurisdictional challenges between the national and state governments. That might ring a bell. And processors across the country operate across the country and not necessarily on a regional basis. So the sense of ownership and stakeholder buy-in seemed to be lacking in terms of trying to develop a strategy at this level. Shifting gears, let's look to the U.S. dairy industry. This was fascinating because what was happening was a major global retailer, happened to be Walmart, moved to develop a sustainability program for all of its operations, and it looked to the U.S. dairy amongst the first to comply with that requirement. The dairy sector, in order to maintain its access to that market channel, had to respond and develop its own sustainability plan. It also has to respond, or had to respond, to the growing societal scrutiny being placed on milk production. Again, something that Terry talked about a little bit. The consequence was that they had a choice. They could either embark upon an individual basis, every dairy trying to develop its own plan in order to preserve their market channel to this one global retailer, or they could act in an organized fashion, largely as an industry. Well, they chose the latter, and the Center for U.S. Dairy took the lead in order to harness the collective will of many, not all, but many in the U.S. dairy industry. The objective was to come up with a commitment to sustainability, a vision, guiding principles, a comprehensive action plan, and they set a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020, and at the same time seek to try to build business value across the chain. What was the outcome? Well, they pulled some 500 stakeholders together with 300 organizations across the dairy industry and with many, many other partners: government, research, NGOs, scientists, environmental specialists, and so on. And they signed partnership agreements and MOUs in order to truly create an environment for change. They created a comprehensive R&D project in order to track and reduce emissions at every level of the supply chain, from feed right through to the consumer. They reduced energy costs through the chain by 10%. They pursued a campaign to adopt biodigesters on farms. What they really were doing, and they issued this in a progress report, which reported on what they were doing on an item-to-item basis, they were really setting the bar to profile the economic, the social, and health benefit of the dairy sector and milk for consumers. This was a proactive opportunity for this sector to stand up and show what it was doing and maintain market access. Just a brief word on the Angus program, a little closer to home. Many of you probably are fully aware of what's going on here, but it's worthwhile noting that the challenge faced by supply chains here also merits different ways of thinking about things. And so what the Angus producers want to do is avoid acceptance of non-Angus cattle into the program, ensure red Angus cattle could access the Angus program. Retailers and packers wanted to identify Angus, which would enhance the differentiation, facilitate labeling, and profile with consumers. And they were in turn responding to what consumers are increasingly wanting, assurance of knowing from where their food comes. The Canadian Angus Association then established the Angus Rancher Endorsed Certification Program. And this created the objective of shifting cattle selection based on hide color to genetic confirmation. And to do it required recognizing the need for greater communication across that supply chain. Many other points were developed in order to pursue this. But the point is, what they've in fact done is they created a registry to increase the standardization and accountability using DNA testing, ear tag traceability, and their modest initial objective of having a handful of branded Angus programs registered grew from 4 to 17, including a major gourmet restaurant chain in Ontario called Hero Burgers. And they've identified a series of next steps to demonstrate value. How do you apply metrics to track the success of the program? And there's a variety of things that they're undertaking right now in order to do so. Shifting to one more example, and this one I think is really quite fascinating. And this takes a much broader view, well beyond an individual supply chain, but it affects the Canadian forestry sector. This sector, as you know, is a major employer for the country, but it was hit by a major trend. Declining pulp consumption, newsprint demand was falling. There was a recession. Low-cost pulp suppliers, such as from Brazil, were taking market share. This is about 10 years ago. U.S. dependence was huge. About 80% of all pulp went to the United States. The appreciation of the Canadian dollar added complexity, as we all know. Rising environmental activism and criticism of pulp or forestry practices. The consequence of all this was massive. Mills closed, layoffs, even towns were shutting down because of the impact that were highly dependent on the forestry sector. There was a lack of confidence across the sector to respond. And consumers all this time were shifting to green in terms of how they made their purchases. So the objective was clear. They were facing a burning platform. How to implement transformational change and strategy in the forestry sector to ensure the economic viability of that sector. So they embarked on a comprehensive program to improve mill productivity, diversify exports, develop new harvesting practices, implement product innovation, try to find new value from wood compounds for all sorts of products, from pharmaceuticals through to car parts manufacturing, and to proactively engage the environmental groups. The outcome? 28 forestry companies got together to respond to the challenge. They increased productivity, dramatically focused on R&D to focus on new value extraction. They're hiring people and expect that number to rise by 40,000, not making up the lost 400, but this has been a restructured industry. In terms of export diversification, their Asian exports have increased from 11% to 28% over a 10-year period. Their value increased in that market from $32 million to $1.5 billion. And they've launched a world-leading conservation program to protect great swaths of the boreal forest, working with NGOs like Greenpeace. And hearing the story of the forestry officials sitting down with environmentalists and how those initial conversations went was quite fascinating. Now, they're not out of the woods yet, pardon the pun. There's still a lot that needs to be done by this sector, but they've transformed how they've worked, and they're now embarking on a new 2020 vision to take them to the next level. So, what do those vignettes really mean? They're varied. They cover a broad landscape. But they actually start to identify a variety of potential winning conditions that might be very useful to keep in mind as we all go forward. And so what they are is we have categorized them into 6. That these cases reveal that strategic shifts work when certain elements are harnessed. So perhaps they're winning conditions. You can be the judge of that. But in order to respond, clearly there's a need for a catalyst. It can be a crisis. Or it can be just an economic opportunity that someone in a supply chain, an entrepreneur or company has identified. The other thing is to understand truly how issues are connected. What's fascinating is that these individual responses or vignettes, and there's others that we have, are trying to understand what's the consumer really wanting. And how's this societal expectations piece play, which Terry was getting at. There's new demands for how we treat animals, the nutritiousness of food, what's in my food, show me that it's safe, demonstrate it. These are expectations that are increasingly facing supply chains. And in part, that's the reason why we think from a system standpoint, we need to bring in these non-food players around the table to help us understand where to go forward. We also need objectives and metrics. This provides a common focus, as some of those examples revealed. It allows us to measure our success and to be accountable. And above all, there has to be a mutual buy-in. It has to be self-interest that drives people to come together. Otherwise, it's unsustainable. What's also interesting across these vignettes and what we're saying in our work is there's the role of information is playing a pretty incredible, has a pretty incredible role in terms of how it's used, shared, applied, or not. And it's a basis to bring people together and align the players. And I'm going to come back to that. But what's clear is that strategic change does reveal or require a broad and integrated approach. So as part of our work in our case study, one of the things that we have come up with is how do you create a dialogue on strategy from people, among people, with very different needs and requirements, a lot of history, and with complex issues. And so I'm not sure if what I've just pointed out are truly the ultimate winning conditions. We think we're in the right place. There might be missing one or two. We might need to refine it. But if they are about on track, then how can we move forward? How can we achieve them? How can we build on them? And so our outreach revealed a real interest in how we can assess and act on those opportunities that are before us. Many want a strategy. Many are looking for a way to get there. Our work is focused on creating this tool, this roadmap, which is only the highlights provided here, as a basis to create that strategic dialogue. Because if we start getting people around the table to talk together about what is the market requiring, do we truly understand what the consumer is saying in that market? What are those societal expectations in Japan versus in Canada? Then what is that product that we need to deliver reliably, safely? What does that nutrition profile look like? How do we segment that to beat out those competitors from elsewhere? And how do we link those players together? Are those conversations occurring where we have Loblaw, Metro, Walmart at the table, perhaps not at the same time, but in terms of conversations, are they at the table as much as they should be? What about McDonald's? Burger King? What about all those folks who supply the universities, colleges, and institutions? They're part of the system, and they need to be part of the dialogue. Above all, we need beef supply. And if we don't have the right capacity, then our pledges to open markets and our capacity to deliver will be stymied. These are the 4 requirements that we see are needed in order to have a new dialogue on strategy. Perhaps there's a 5th. You know, this is what we're doing, is trying to offer a platform to bring people together. But what we're seeing and what we've been hearing from people across the sector is there's a need to understand those linkages because these issues are complex. We need the stakeholders to help start coming around the table to identify barriers together and the strategic opportunities. This is the basis to identify those objectives that I pointed out earlier in those vignettes, and to sustain the opportunity to deliver on them. Otherwise, you won't get that alignment, and execution won't be possible. It's not up to us, CAPI, an organization in Ottawa, to prescribe the beef sector strategy. But the approach that we are offering, based on the feedback we heard, might just enable that strategy to take place. And if that can help define our competitive advantage in the beef sector on a go-forward basis to create those profitable opportunities, then maybe that's just worth it. Thank you very much.